and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and it's time for June's monthly reading wrap-up. This past month I read a total of 16 books, but the only reason why that happened is because I borrowed a lot of unplanned graphic novels / comic books from my local library. So yeah, and that included an actual series of graphic novels, Locke and Key, which I will obviously talk about in a moment. So yeah, 16 books. That's not gonna happen again anytime soon, I can tell you that. This time around, I'm going to go by category of things I read. Non-fiction, the graphic stuff, and then the novels. So not in chronological order. So the one book of non-fiction I read in June was Histoire du Viol du XVIe au XXe siècle by Georges Vigarello. This was a historical treatise on the societal and judicial aspects of rape in France between the 16th and 20th centuries. And it was very interesting, fairly thorough, a bit dense at times if I'm being perfectly honest, though once I really got into it, I read through it reasonably quickly. There's a lot of information on the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. However, there's a big data gap for the 20th century. You jump from like the end of the 19th century to like the 1970s. That was a bit weird. I don't know why that was the case. Is it because there weren't any major shifts in societal habits and laws, judicial proceedings between, the turn of the 20th century and the late 20th century? I don't know, it didn't explain why there was that big data gap. I guess another complaint I had is that at times I felt aspects of rape culture theory were missing, or they could have been relevant to such historical treaties. That being said, clearly the author isn't specifically a feminist, so that's fine. And to be fair, there wasn't any sexism or sexist bias in this treatise, and the author does talk about the impacts of male domination, inequality between the sexes, so I don't really have any major complaints in that regard. Another thing though is that at times I thought the focus of this treatise was a bit too much on child rape and what we would today call pedophilia. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely an important link between rape of adults and women, more specifically rape of children. There's a continuum of sexual violence, but then there are also specificities to child rape and sexual assault against children. I say this also because I plan on reading a historical treatise on pedophilia, the phenomenon today known as pedophilia, so I'm assuming I'm going to get a lot of info in that book, so I felt like this book could have dedicated more space to rape of adults, I guess. But then that's kind of also explained by the fact that the author says that for most of recorded history, rapes against adults weren't really reported or, prosecuted, and people only really cared about rapes against children, and even then, the most extreme cases of rape against children. What's also kind of sad is that a lot of things have thankfully changed over the centuries, and then a few things haven't really changed. Like a lot of the stereotypes that still exist around rape, around sexual assault, around the responsibility, of victims, they have their roots going back 400 years and were present in a slightly altered form as far back as the 16th century. Now, sure, a lot of the religious content of those centuries is gone, but still, considering the victim to be responsible because she didn't protect her virtue well enough, because of the way she dresses, because she had relationships with her abuser or rapist, that still exists. Even considering younger teenagers or the children to be responsible for the sexual violence they experience. It's fascinating to see how much and how little has changed over 400 years of history. In short, I would definitely recommend this if you're interested in the subject and you read French, obviously, though at times it is a bit dense and could have used, theoretical imports from other but somewhat related fields, like feminist or feminist adjacent theory, I guess. But ultimately, I wasn't that bothered by its absence either. Then 2 works of graphic non-fiction, which I don't have with me anymore because they were borrowed from the library. First, I read Culottées Volume 1 by Pénélope Bagieu. The premise of this comic book is very similar to the art books Women in Science and Women in Art by Rachel Ignatowski, though without like a central theme like, women in science or women in art. It basically features biographical vignettes about very different kinds of women who led very independent and interesting lives and contributed in some way or another to the world. I mean, at times the contributions were very minor, but they were women who challenged the gender stereotypes of their time, challenged the constraints placed on them because of their sex. Overall, very inspiring stories, basically. And I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed the art style. I enjoyed the format of, biographical vignettes. It was highly enjoyable, definitely feminist adjacent, I'll say. And just, portrayed very different kinds of women. Like I said, there was a woman with a beard who lived, beginning of the 20th century. You had also, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, but a Native American warrior, a Chinese empress, and also, I don't remember her name, but a very famous black singer, dancer who was also a resistant during World War II in France. I really adored that vignette. It was fascinating, and I was really happy to learn more about her. There's a volume 2 that I plan on reading as well, and also it does exist in English. I think both of these volumes were smooshed into one, and it was published as Brazen, Women Who Challenged the World, something like that. So if you don't speak French but want to check this out, you can. Then on a somewhat related note, I read Histoire de Femmes, and I don't have the book before me, so I do not remember the name of the authors, apologies, but it was translated from the Norwegian, so written and illustrated by 2 Norwegian women, and it was basically a little historical account of feminism and feminist struggles. I enjoyed it. I liked the art style. It covered a wide-ish array of topics, but fairly superficially. One thing I didn't quite like about this book is that I felt it lacked a directing structure. It mixed different events from different time periods in a weird way, and so you would, go from a chapter on socialist feminists in, first half of the 20th century to a vignette about an Iranian feminist activist, then a bit about Malala Yousafzai. Apologies if I got that wrong. And then a bit about lesbian feminists. I mean, it was interesting, but it could have benefited from a more coherent structure, basically. I think it'd be a good book to give to a younger woman or an older girl or an older boy, why not, to give them a taste of feminist history. It's a good starting point, I guess, but if you're familiar with this, the structure might be a bit jarring and you'll want more information, basically. So like I said in the intro, I, took the opportunity of checking out all 6 volumes of Locke and Key from my local library, written by Jordahl and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez. I read it in French, so technically I read it translated. It kind of violates my rule of never reading something from one of my native languages translated into the other. But the thing is, it was available at my local library, and I have limited funds, so I was like, you know what, I'm going to make an exception for non-fiction and graphic fiction and non-fiction. So I still have volumes 4, 5, and 6 with me. I have to take them back into the library. So I binge-read this series, and I liked it, but I was slightly disappointed because I was expecting something more. I'm not sure exactly what that more should have been, but I was expecting it. That being said, it was an enjoyable light horror, supernatural horror, psychological horror series. But there is some graphic violence, but I don't know, it wasn't that heavy on the horror in my opinion. So the basic premise is that you have a family, a mother, her 3 kids. The father is murdered, and the family moves back to the father's childhood home in the town of Lovecraft. Wink, wink, in this old mansion called Key House. And in this mansion are lots of very strange keys that open very strange locks on doors that do various different kinds of strange supernatural things, like mess around with time, become a ghost, become an animal, things like that. and there's this nefarious presence at this key house that presumably harbors mysterious, nefarious intents. We follow the three children primarily, their adventures, what happens to them at school, at this key house, them messing about with those keys and interacting with this nefarious presence. And I won't say more than that because I don't want to spoil the series. I will say this though, there's a little nod. Again, there's a wink wink to the the town called Lovecraft. And there's a little nod to Lovecraftian cosmic horror. I won't say what it is exactly, but if you're familiar with Lovecraft's work, you'll spot it without a doubt. And I was like, nice. Overall, I thought the first half of the series was a bit weak insofar as I was expecting a lot more to actually happen and a lot more exposition to be actually done in those volumes. Because, each volume is about 160 pages apart, and not that much happens actually for that amount of pages. So I was a bit, again, disappointed about that. Then you get a lot of the background info, and a lot of the action comes in volumes 4, 5, and 6, obviously, with the finale. And the finale was overall satisfying. Something does happen which I felt was a little unearned, narratively speaking. At first I thought it broke the world building rules, but then I went to, check the finer details and I was like, okay, no, I see how that happened and it does respect the pre-established world building rules. So fair enough, but still, it felt a little bit unearned. So I was a bit meh about that. So overall, I gave the series a solid 7 out of 10. If you like this kind of content, I would definitely recommend you check it out. But it's not an all-time favorite. And so this was definitely a spur of the moment borrow from the library. It's Woman World by Aminder Dhaliwal. So I had no idea what this was going to be before I read it. It was really a spur of the moment pick. The basic premise was a sort of post-apocalyptic world without men. I'd read Why the Last Man. I've read fiction. Playing around with that idea was this could be interesting, and it was supposed to be funny. This did nothing for me, basically. I can't really say I was disappointed because I wasn't really expecting anything particular out of it. As far as I understand, this is a collection of Instagram vignette-type comics that was just compiled into a book. There isn't any overarching narrative to it, or there is in the loosest meaning of the word possible. It's supposed to be funny, but 90% of the humor just went straight over my head. I was going through the pages, and I was like, that's the joke. Okay, next page. Okay, next page. I was just neutral face, basically, for most of it. I was like, this is supposed to be funny. I do not get it, and I guess, the art style was right. It's a doodly kind of art style, which can be cute, but since there wasn't really anything story-wise, world-building-wise, or theme-wise, it was a bit bare bones. I didn't have much to chew on there, so not good enough. Given that this book didn't have anything else going for it, basically. And then I read this chunky gal, L'Âge d'Or by Cyril, Pedrosa, et Roxanne Moreil. This has been translated into English if you want to check it out. I was aware of this comic book from a while back, to be honest. I'd seen it in bookshops, and it looked like something I could potentially enjoy. But given that it is a chunky gal, it means it's an expensive gal as well. And I was like, do I spend the money on this, running the risk of not enjoying it? It never quite made my TBR list, the TBR where I have to actually buy the books. But then I saw it was at my local library and was like, yay, I can check it out for free. It was good-ish. It was alright. I gave it a 6.5 out of 10. The story is a reinterpretation of a classic medieval epic, except the hero in this case is a heroine. It is a woman whose father, the king, has died, and so she's supposed to ascend to the throne, but then her mother, an advisor, basically, mount a coup against her and put her little brother on the throne, so she has to go into exile. But then there's also a subplot with this text talking about a golden age where there were no lords and serfs and everyone was equal, and so you've got peasants mounting rebellions trying to put these ideals into practice with the help of this philosopher figure. And then there's a village with women living independently. It's obvious there's a volume 2, and that there is a volume 2 that I also plan on checking out this coming month, because overall, even though there's 228 pages in this book, not that much happens once again, and it ends on a pretty massive cliffhanger, so you have to have a second arc, or a continuation to the story. The real draw of this book is the art style. It's quite something. You've got, pages like this, but then you have these spreads that are just always very colorful, very vivid. And you know, the weird thing is that at times I found the colors too vivid. It was almost sensory overload. And then the thing is, the artist doesn't stick to one palette for very long, so you have these intense colors fluctuating every 2 pages, just assaulting your eyes and your brain. But I mean, it's beautiful as well, right? A lot of these pages feature characters moving around, but on the same frame, basically. I'm not expressing this accurately, so sorry about that. But basically, it's a lot like drawings used to be in medieval times. It also reminded me of like medieval tapestries, like the Lady with the Unicorn, which I've seen in Paris. The beautiful tapestries, I highly recommend you check that museum out if you're up in Paris. So I thought that was really neat, that callback to medieval art. But I also thought there were kind of these little impressionistic notes in like the backgrounds, the trees. So I definitely want to give points for the art style. It's very special and very dreamlike at times, but sometimes it's a bit too dreamlike and too acid trip-like in a way, because these colors are just so vivid and so in your face. So now on to the novel / prose fiction with a bit of poetry thrown in, because first I'm going to mention Beren and Lùthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't need to say much about this because if you're a fantasy fan, if you're a Tolkien fan, or just, you know, aware of SFF literature, you kind of already know what this is. It is not a novelized, more detailed retelling of the Beren and Lùthien story you find in the Silmarillion, like The Children of Hurin is. This is more like an exposition of the chronological progression and evolution of the Beren and Lùthien story, with like little explanations by Christopher Tolkien on his father's writing process and research process. And so you have different versions of Beren and Lùthien. One which is really old, which doesn't even fit into the Tolkien legendarium because it wasn't really finished yet. And then you've got this epic poetry version of it, part of it in epic poetry form, which, to my surprise, I actually kind of liked. I dug the epic poetry. There was a nice cadence to it, and I really got into the flow and rhythm of reading through that epic poetry, so neat. Ultimately, you don't really get anything that new based on the finished version you get in the Silmarillion. Like, that's the most complete version we'll ever get, right? It's kind of weird to evaluate this honestly. I gave it a 6 out of 10, I think. I really liked the epic poetry. I liked reading Tolkien's prose and verse, but it wasn't anything new, and it wasn't like The Children of Hurin, unfortunately. That is what I would have liked, but that's not what you get when you read this. And it's not what I'm going to get when I read through The Fall of Gondolin this month, but I'm still going to read through it because that way I get extra Tolkien nerd points, I guess. So, onto the novels proper. I read Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. I did a full-length video review for that one if you'd like to check it out. I basically mostly compare it to the movie by Steven Spielberg because that's like my point of reference. I preferred the movie to the novel. The novel was fine. It was entertaining. I didn't like the anti-science rants Dr. Ian Malcolm goes into in the book, which thankfully aren't present in the movie. A lot of the dino science is outdated, but you can levy that criticism at the movie as well, and it's perfectly legitimate, obviously. It was an easy, fast read, and I don't think it was ever meant to be super deep science fiction, and that's perfectly fine. I personally wouldn't really recommend it given we have the movie by Steven Spielberg. That being said, you know, if you've got a few hours to kill, or a couple of days of reading to kill, you could go for that one. It's enjoyable enough, I'll say that. Then I read a classic, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm not entirely sure why I decided to pick up that classic. Methinks it had something to do with me once reading about Nathaniel Hawthorne, about the fact he'd lived on a utopian commune for a while. Whatever, I read it. It was fine. It was between a 5 and a 6 out of 10 for me. I've read better classics. I've read worse classics. The writing was fine, I guess. It's kind of interesting, actually, that it was written in the 19th century, so the narration, the third-person narration, is in a style you would associate with the 19th century, but then the dialogue between the characters is really old-timey English, which you would associate with, like, the 17th century, or is it the 16th? can't remember exactly, but I mean, that period. So you have these two older styles in that book, which is kind of interesting to read from like a contemporary perspective. The character work was, I mean, alright, very, I don't know, archetypal or stereotypical, but it's because it's more a moral fable than anything else about like sin, redemption. I mean, there's a whole bit in the introduction about feminine values of like compassion, kindness, and things like that, which are supposed to be represented by Hester Prynne, the main female protagonist of the Scarlet Letter. I didn't think it came through that strongly in the text itself. Apparently, Nathaniel Hawthorne was trying to go for like, let's prioritize more matriarchal values. I mean, maybe. I don't know. It wasn't that obvious to me in the text. I don't think the theming was that rich or deep. I feel like this is the kind of book I should have read in a school setting, whether high school or, higher education, because then I probably would have had additional social, cultural, historical context to draw on and draw parallels to. The kind of stuff I had in my French literature courses in high school, or works I didn't otherwise, enjoy that much. So yeah, I think I'm missing quite a bit about this novel, because on its own, I don't really see much of the point as a contemporary reader. Like their classics, which I personally think deserve their status as classics. And, that's a whole other conversation. Scarlet Letter to me is pretty middle of the road. I'm like, there are more interesting classics out there, basically. Then I also read Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. This wasn't at all planned on my yearly TBR when, I drew it up. But once again, now that I have a local library, when I went to it at the beginning of the month, went to the English novels stack. I mean, it's a tower with books in English. I call it the English novels stack. I saw this book. I had read about it in conjunction with books like My Dark Vanessa and Me Too represented in literature, in articles and such. So I was like, oh, right, they have this here. It's fairly short. I'll find a way to squeeze this in. And it was not very good. In my GoodReads review, I qualified it as pretentious twaddle. I know, it's a bit harsh, but I stand by that statement because it's the kind of book that I just felt was very pretentious, very snobbish. It plays around with narrative structure, and it's like a story within a story within a story, and it mirrors the title in 3 different ways, and you're not really sure who the characters are, because there's a switcheroo going on after part 1, because there are 3 parts in this book, but then there's a switch around again in part 3, and I'm like, okay, once was relatively clever, but you're gonna do it again? Really? The basic premise of this book is high school students going to a school specializing in the performing arts, and it centers around a character named Sarah and a character named, I can't remember, see, it didn't stick in my mind that much, but a male teenager, sorry. They're theatre majors, and there's this super intense, kind of creepy theatre professor who makes them go through trust exercises that are darkly intense and, borderline inappropriate. So there's a story revolving around this Sarah and her boyfriend and this teacher. And then in part 2, the perspective shifts. It's told from the point of view of a character, which you thought was not important at all in part 1, but was in fact an entirely different character. And it's again, it's the story within a story within a story, and unreliable narrators out the wazoo. Everyone is an unreliable narrator. The narrative itself is massively unreliable, and I guess it's supposed to be clever, but at a certain point, I felt this book was trying to make me feel like an idiot, because it was being super special with its weird narrative structure, and I was like, no, you know what, it's not clever, it's pretentious. I'm all for experimental, well no, you know what, I'm not that for experimental fiction, actually, because of these kinds of experiences, playing a little bit with narrative structure, cool. But you know what? If most novels are told a certain way, it's because that formula works. That's my conclusion. So just twisting it in all these weird shapes, you know what? It's just pretentious. And there's supposed to be commentary about Me Too and about re-examining experiences of sexual abuse and trauma. And I was like, no, not how? How does this contribute to the conversation about Me Too? Compared to something like My Dark Vanessa or Putney? Are you freaking kidding me? No. I had to go read an article explaining what the story was supposedly all about. And I'm like, if I have to go read a third-party article, which in any case will always just remain that person's personal opinion, to understand a freaking novel, then the author did a bad job. And finally, this month, I reread You by Joanna Briscoe. The first time I read this was 5 or 6 years ago? Not sure. I read it because it features a relationship between a 17-year-old and her 19 years older teacher, English teacher once again. I read this at first for the wrong reason, in a way, because I was trying to find, narratives that mirrored some of the things I'd experienced, but like from a very different vantage point, basically. Since I've now had massive shifts in perception regarding my experience with that, I wanted to reread this to see what I would make of it now, and, because I'd kept it even after my massive book on hold from a couple of months back. And I enjoyed this. It held up. I gave it a 7 out of 10. So you do have this relationship. You also kind of have a lesbian affair between this main character's mother and her teacher's wife. It's one of these stories that features like convoluted interpersonal relationship dramas. I'm not really drawn to that as a general principle, but a lot of people do like that. It was very well written. That's one thing I did like about this book. I thought it was actually quite beautifully written, and it did have interesting things to say about memory, about relationships, about how relationships impact us in our younger years and what we carry along with us in our lives from those younger years. And I thought it offered interesting commentary even on that, age gap relationship, which is iffy given Cecilia's age. But from the characterization given to us by the author, I would say it's an actual edge case relationship. It's a gray area relationship. It's not terribly ethical or healthy at first, but I don't think it was outright abusive. It wasn't grooming in any case. I don't think the teacher character is the best person on earth at all, but he wasn't a complete arsehole or monster none of those characters are really complete monsters because they're still human beings, but characters like Jacob Strain in My Dog Vanessa or Ralph Boyd in Putney, you know what I mean? I got something out of it thinking about my own experiences, thinking about painful memories, and even trauma, even though trauma is not addressed specifically in this book. On a more general basis, I would recommend this if you like introspective stories about the human psyche, about relationships that shape us in our childhood and our teenage years, and, slightly convoluted relationship dramas. So in July, I'm going to read a lot less, I can already tell you that. But on my TBR is Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. There is the new Crobuzon trilogy by China Mieville. I'm very excited for that one. I'm excited for that one. So that comprises Perdido Street Station, The Scar, and I'm Council, and they're all fairly chunky books as well. I plan on, like I already mentioned, reading The Fall of Gondolin by, J.R.R. Tolkien and, edited by Christopher Tolkien. And then that's going to be about it, because, the new Crobuzon trilogy is chunky. I don't want to be distracted by anything else because I have other things to do, and I get super easily stressed when I feel like I'm not doing enough of things on my to-do list. I'm just going to try and read 2 books of nonfiction this month: Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates with Vita Nostra, and Inferior by Angela Saini with The Fall of Gondolin. But then I'm probably going to pick up some of these books of graphic fiction and graphic nonfiction I mentioned from my local library, but that's fine. That won't take up too much of my attention span, which is all over the place because depression and anxiety are awesome. Who knows? I might just chuck in something extra at some point because why not? I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you fairly soon in the next video. Bye-bye.